Welcome back to the Female Dating Strategy, the meanest female-only podcast on the internet. I'm your host, Diana.
And I'm Rose.
And today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Ashni Dhawale. She specializes in animal behavior, and her PhD is focused on examining the behavioral and cognitive adaptations of the lion-tailed macaque in response to man-made changes in their habitat. She is currently studying their behavior in Sulawesi, Indonesia. So, Ashni, we're very excited to have you here because you claim that your past dating life may not be as dramatic as the monkeys you study, but, we want to hear from you. We want to hear whether we're the more dramatic ones or whether those monkeys are the more dramatic ones.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here and thank you for having me. So I may not have a very dramatic personal life. I think the monkeys are definitely more dramatic, but let's see, we'll see maybe as the conversation goes ahead.
Well, and Diana, I love how you nicknamed this episode Monkey Business. And I especially was just like, aren't we always telling people like enough of that monkey business? Like, cut out that tomfoolery. One thing that we were talking about, Diana, is you were saying, why are we talking about alpha wolves when our closest relatives in the animal kingdom are, in fact, the primates?
Mm-hmm.
And this is when you said, actually, I have a friend, a very dear friend, who studies this very topic. Should we see if we can interview her? So, Ashni, that's how this all came about. And we are just so delighted to have you here today. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me and for inviting me on this extremely special podcast. I can't wait to be a part of this.
Diana, how do we get started? Do we have questions lined up?
Well, before we get in, obviously we want to debunk like all of the popular alpha wolf myths that men have come up with because, these podcast bros have come up with all sorts of stupid ideas about the animal kingdom to justify how shitty they treat women. Obviously, want Ashni to explain what actually goes down in the animal kingdom because she's the expert. But Ashni, if you want to lead us in on your, what's your experience been as a scientist, as a woman of science, as a woman in STEM? What has been your dating experience? Do you want to give us a brief sort of look into your life? And FDS is all about helping women maximize female benefit. And we pride ourselves on being a resource to all sorts of women on how to improve their lives, especially their dating lives. So we would love to, have some insight from you or just, learn more about you personally before we get into your work.
That is such a great point. And actually, can you tell us how you even came to this field of study, Ashni?
Yeah, so I think as a child, I was very interested in animals and animal behavior. I think for the longest time, I wanted to be a vet, which child didn't. But I took my dream seriously, and I'll give myself credit with a lot of hard work. I managed to find a field that allows me to translate those just childish dreams and my passion for animals into a legitimate career, if I may say so myself. And so I was pretty certain from very early on that I wanted to be in a field of work where I was involved with animals. And sometime during my high school, I kind of figured that you can make a career out of studying animal behavior. And it seemed like the absolute perfect thing that I would want to do. Of course, there were a bunch of challenges. I had to pursue very specific subjects to be able to get into the field. And I decided not to and continued to study the subjects that I really wanted to, which involved English literature, philosophy, and so on. Luckily, there was one opportunity in India that allowed me to move into wildlife studies. And so I moved from a Bachelor of Arts to a Master's of Science and found my way back to studying animal behavior. My specific professional training is in wildlife biology and conservation of wild species. And it's just been a crazy roller coaster ride since then.
What a well-rounded background. It's really rare to hear about somebody going from a BA to an MS. Have you noticed that amongst your colleagues?
Oh, yes. I'm definitely the one that's always the kind of outsider looking in, but I find it quite comforting to know that I bring the interdisciplinary aspects to the table and that I always have something to offer that perhaps my colleagues may not have experience with. There are times when it's extremely challenging to have to then work in a field that I don't sort of belong to. And I feel like that's really equipped me to deal with other aspects of my life where I kind of feel like the outsider. It makes me more comfortable, and it sort of gives me the sense that I can do it, I can figure it out. And it's definitely sort of helped my personal growth and development as a person as well.
Diana, you said you've known Ashni for a very long time. Have you been able to follow her journey and kind of see as a friend what it's been like, the sort of challenges and victories that she's had to earn on her own 2 feet?
I definitely feel like she's always exhibited a very high level of ambition and drive. So for her to be able to switch from the BA to the MS, I couldn't imagine anybody else who could have pulled it off. But, that being said, I do think that she's found a path where she has found some belonging. That's where I disagree with her. I don't think that she doesn't belong. I think she's definitely found a way to make herself irreplaceable, and she's brought a lot of unique perspective to her field. I mean, that's why she's still succeeding to this day. So I definitely feel like, both of us had nursed this ambition when we were kids. We both wanted to be vets. That was like a kind of goal we shared together. Of course, it's kind of interesting that our career trajectories are the complete opposite of each other, because she went from the arts to the sciences and I went from the sciences to the arts. So I went to vet school and then now I ended up in like the film world and she wound up. So we kind of went in opposite directions, because for me personally, after I actually went to vet school, I kind of got disillusioned with like just the whole space of doctors in general. I mean, at least in the States, where I did my medical training, a lot of the people who were in vet school were mainly people who were working on their family farms. So they kind of had, a guaranteed job right after they left. And obviously, when you're an immigrant to the States, that becomes something, it's a very heavy investment to invest in medical school in general. And it's a very expensive field to follow. But I mean, beyond the expenses, it's not like I didn't think I could do it, but it's just that at the same time, I always nursed the ambition to also be a filmmaker. And so for me, that, I just allowed myself to honor it. And so I feel like the paths that we both went on were naturally suited to our unique talents and our gifts. And having known her her whole life, I feel like she's been really consistent. You know what I mean? Like every single thing that she's told me about what she's achieved in life has never been something that I'm like, oh, this is so random. Like I couldn't imagine that. Like she's always been very consistent in her pursuit, like, in her pursuit of her goals. She's always had like a very strong sense of focus and passion. It made a lot of sense that she entered this line of work. You can tell her passion for the subject just almost immediately. And there's very few people I can think of that you meet, that almost immediately that the love for their field kind of radiates.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Diana. I think that that's pretty accurate description.
Would you give us a little insight into how you've come to know and understand Diana as a lifelong friend as well, Ashni?
Yeah, so I think because we shared a lot of similar interests as children, a lot of our core memories are probably based on the same life experiences that we shared. I think that's something that really bonds you for life. It's also extremely interesting to me that we have very different career trajectories, but I feel like that's really what has always made us sort of enriched in this friendship, is because we truly complement each other, and there's aspects of various fields that we've tried and tested through our education that appeal to each of us. Ultimately, I do still think fundamentally we are quite similar, but what we sort of, the way we perceive the world, I would in fact say that yes, I have had a very single track mind in terms of the career I want to pursue. I feel Diana, in that sense, has actually been much more open to her experiences, her lived experiences, and kind of grown through her time in various fields. And I learn a lot from her. And I think she's always been sort of a voice of reason that yells at me sometimes from the background. And I take her voice very seriously. I think I value her learnings and then things she offers to my life.
Oh, I just love to hear a relationship. I love to hear about friendship like this. And it seems like you both are able to bring your own backgrounds to your lives in complementary ways, but also for creating your own paths. And isn't that so exciting in the world we live in today?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think, to have a friendship that's been as long as ours and to still have mutual respect for each other, I think is a very beautiful thing. And our earliest relationships, and we've seen each other through like various stages of our lives. And I'm sure that that will keep happening, as we age. We've really seen each other, despite like our careers are one aspect of it, but who we are as people and how we've evolved as well. I feel like we've seen each other through those transitions. And yeah, it's a really awesome thing to witness, because I don't think that there's a lot of people in the world that can boast of a friendship like ours. Actually, it's quite rare, I would say.
Yes. Well, what I've been learning about Diana's background, Ashni, is I've been talking with her over the last episodes that we've been recording as new co-hosts. Just hearing about Diana's life and the different experiences she's had and the different places she's lived. It's like, this is a very singular life that you lead, Diana. And I imagine that has its pros and its cons, but I think finding a friend who you can take from place to place throughout the years is something that's really special.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
I think, one of the things we always tell our listeners as well is that, I think Judge Toller said this as well, right? You can't singularly focus on one aspect of your life to the detriment of others. And I think that, I've spent a lot of my life being single. I don't think that I've been into too many long-term relationships. But I think one of my biggest strengths is that I've always been able to make friends. And I've kind of had to, right? Because I've just lived all over the world. And so I just really didn't have any option if I wanted to form roots or connections in places. And so, I think it's really important for the people who listen to this podcast to understand that, your dating life is important. Who you find to, be a permanent partner is very, very important. But you need to also make sure that you have robust networks of support and that it isn't just all resting on one man, and you shouldn't be so singularly focused on your romantic life that you forget to focus on all the other aspects of your life that make life worthwhile. And so, I'm quite proud of the fact that I do have these these long-term connections with people like Ashni. And also, I've made a lot of friends in the last 10 years of my life where I've been moving around as well. And, I'm continuing doing that. I mean, we're doing this podcast together. I'd like to think we're friends now.
I would hope so. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you continue to meet people who add so much value to your life. And some people are there, for a season, and some people are there for the entire journey. And, each of them have something valuable to add to your lives. That's one thing that, I keep trying to impress on this podcast as well with past episodes, is that it is very important, when we talk about female solidarity, it's not just to show up for each other when we're being discriminated against. It's to really, really show up for each other when we need that support and we need that boost and we need that acknowledgement and validation and support in our lives, in our daily lives.
Absolutely. And Diana, actually, while you were talking, you led me into a question that I have for Ashni, which is, Ashni, in the animal kingdom, you specifically study gold-tailed, is it macaque? How do I pronounce that?
The lion-tailed macaque.
The lion-tailed macaque. And you're doing that work out of Sulawesi, Indonesia?
No, so that was my PhD work back in India, and now I'm studying a different species of macaque in Sulawesi, but it's also a macaque.
Okay, so it's a different kind of macaque, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question to you is, in this animal kingdom that you study from India to Indonesia, do animals tend to prize above all other relationships that between like mating pairs, or is it a far more egalitarian collective endeavor? How would you describe it to a layman like myself?
Yeah, I would actually describe it as, the technical term is female philopatric, which actually means governed by the females. And it is most importantly a female centric society. In both cases of both the macaque species, the females are the ones that are born into a group and remain in the group for their entire lives. They forge relationships of all kinds, so with their parents, with members of their cohort, so other babies that are born at the exact same time as them, we call those friendships, and also with other relationships like their older siblings or younger siblings and so on. And so I would actually characterize a society, it's not even a personal characterization, it is officially called a female philopatric society, which means that it's female oriented, female centric, and the strongest bonds that the macaques observe are amongst the females. I have a publication that's available online, which is titled, in fact, Female Friendships. And so that's the kind of work that I also like to focus on.
I need to know everything. So, so I just did a little quick search. Philopatric is the word. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And it says here it's the tendency of an animal to remain in or return to its natal area, its natal habitat. Is that correct?
Right. And so the bond essentially of being born into and remaining in is governed by the females. And so if you're born into a group that is defined by or composed by a certain group of females. You remain in that group or you return to that group. And so the females remain together, whereas the males are the ones that kind of come and go.
And what are the benefits to the female animals to remaining as sort of like the home zone, so to speak?
Right. So I think the main sort of biological basis of this would be that females are the ones that essentially track resources. What is most important to females in the wild, in macaque societies and primate societies, is tracking the resources, the essentials that they need to survive. And for the males, it's tracking the females because they need the females to produce offspring. And so the females are really just concerned with keeping themselves alive and keeping themselves safe. And so what is important then is that the females banding together are the ones that really help in keeping each other alive. They help in keeping each other safe. And so what really defines this kind of society is that because the females are really tracking the essentials, they are the ones that have the best resources to survive. Whereas the males are really just trying to make sure that their lineage continues. And so they need to track the females, which is why they kind of move around.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Let me get this straight, Jayana.
Yeah.
women. I love this so much. I'm so happy. I am geeking out.
I want the scrotes to pay attention to this. You are not the providers of anything. You are not the resource providers. Okay, you are not the protectors. You aren't even there in the animal kingdom. Okay, hear that, scrotes? You heard it from Dr. Ashni Dhawale first. Okay.
Yep.
So it sounds like females are focused on surviving and thriving, and males are focused on women as survival. In other words.
Yes. Exactly.
Okay, so let me just get this straight. The male alpha is not the most important member of this troop then. He's not just beating his chest and being like, ooh, ooh, and all of the girls are running after him because he's refusing. Let me just check. Because the scrotes need to understand what we're doing.
No, the alpha, if there even is one, has very specific roles that you might somehow twist into being the most important. But when it comes to survival, when it comes to thriving and creating space for very complex cognitive social interactions, behaviors, and relationships, it is the females that really drive the society.
Right, because right now the information we have about this alpha wolf myth is that it's like one wolf who's like the head of the pack, who's at the front of the pack and leading them with his chest puffed out, leading all of the other female wolves, the submissive female wolves into, into resources. We'd like to have some clarification on that from someone who's actually in this field because we need to put a stop to this, stupidity.
Yeah, yes. So firstly, before directly addressing this specific point, I also want to point out that most of science began and at the forefront of science when science and the field of animal behavior emerged was men. Men were the ones that were deciding what to study, who to study, when to study. And a lot of the questions that were then asked were very extremely male centric. And so, for example, this whole idea of a dominance rank, and here I'll just take a second to debunk this myth. Firstly, it isn't really an alpha where one singular male individual is kind of somehow deemed the alpha male of the pack and that he's the one leading and finding resources. He again has very specific roles. It does not have much to do with dominance as such. It has to do with age and experience, which is not a very gendered kind of concept. Age and experience comes with age. And so if you see individuals that are older, they will have more experience. They are more likely to know when to avoid a fight, more specifically than when to engage in a fight. And so when to take pacifist stand, and again, when to avoid a fight to survive. And so the kind of value that a more experienced male or female, I might add, especially with the wolves, there is both males and females. They have specific roles again, and these might change, they may vary. It has a lot to do with the circumstances of where they live. And we've stopped using the word alpha quite a while ago in the field of science. We do not use it in our publications or in explaining what we're studying. But the individuals that placed in a certain position on the dominance rank, they come with more experience. And often this experience is more valuable when you know when to avoid a conflict rather than to engage or to display your aggressive tendencies. And so to come back to what they chose to study, firstly, they chose to look at dominance rank as a very vertical structure. So think of it as a ladder. And as you climb up the ladder, you go higher to the top of the dominance rank. But I also want to point out that in evolution, and sorry to get a little technical, but essentially what controls evolution is the process of natural selection. And natural selection is a very realizable consequence of your actions. And so, if you exhibit certain behaviors or if you have certain traits that are advantageous to you, you will survive and go on to tell the tale and then pass on those traits. If those traits are disadvantageous, you will die and you will not pass on those traits. And so, the process of natural selection is extremely it's a natural order of things. And so, when you think of a dominance rank, you think of individuals that are at the top of this so-called ladder that are supposedly more advantageous, and they have all these benefits to being a more dominant individual, which is access to food or space or allies or mates. But then the process of natural selection has also allowed for individuals at the bottom of the ladder. That's why they even exist today, because those individuals at the bottom of this ladder are still surviving. They're the survivors. They're the ones who avoid conflict. They're the ones who know how to behave and sort of remain within a group in a way that they aren't just killed off. And that is also the process of natural selection. They are selected for as well. So it's the technical term is dominance hierarchy, but I would think of it more as a horizontal structure rather than a vertical one, where there's just individuals at two ends of a horizontal spectrum that have different functions and strategies to ultimately survive. Both groups survive. And I would imagine when a male scientist looks at the system, they will immediately assume and sort of conceptualize this entire system as being hierarchical, because why wouldn't you want to see one individual on top of the other individual and so on and so forth? I, in fact, would go on to say that if women were at the forefront of these scientific studies, I wouldn't be surprised if they conceptualize the whole idea of dominance as a more horizontal spectrum rather than a vertical hierarchy or structure.
I just wanted to note, and then I would like to get back to how beautifully you were explaining things. But I was looking this up, and apparently one of the researchers who had coined this term, who later had it officially retracted from academic journals, was L. David Mech. Is that right?
Yes.
A senior research scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey. And what he noticed was, first of all, these terms are decades out of date. Most importantly, this terminology around an alpha wolf arose from research done on captive wolf packs and also animals that had no shared kinship. So these were stranger wolves to one another. That's in the case. That's where a dominance hierarchy would arise. But he says, this Mech says, that's the animal equivalent of what might happen in a human prison, not the way wolves behave when they are left to their own devices.
Because at the end of the day, they're not in their natural environment, right? You know, Ashni and I had this discussion a little while ago about how this particular field of study is also dominated by scrotes who are looking at it through a very, scrotological kind of view.
Scrotological. I love it.
And yeah, and a lot of their funding. You remember the story that you were telling me about the guy who got funded for something ridiculous? Do you remember the story that you were telling me about the guy who got what was it about?
Oh, yes. The discussion was about, again, some early research that happened somewhere in the UK. I can get details, but it's a bird species called the Jasana, and they went out with the question that they wanted to know how aggressive the male birds are in this population. And so these birds live in groups of ranging between a few tens to 500 or more individuals. So they're extremely large broods. And they sort of went out to look at the levels of aggression exhibited by males, because very often, and even to date, most of the time, base assumption is that the males are kind of the ones in charge of the aggressive interactions. And to a certain degree, and again, there is a reason behind it that needs to be kind of really looked at and analyzed. There are nuances. But the base assumption is that the males are the ones that are in control of these aggressive territorial conflicts between males. So it's like a male male kind of thing. And so they went out to measure the aggression between male Jasana birds. And so what they did is that they just recorded all instances of any aggression that they observed in this brood of maybe 500, 600 birds, and they noted it down. And when they went to sort of plug in all this data into the statistical models, and statistics, my friend, do not lie, they found that they had to dump most of their data because the females were the ones that were showing the aggressive interactions. The females were the ones that were driving the kind of conflicts that were controlling their ability to maintain a territory, controlling their ability to mate, and so on. And so, what they ended up with is very little data to say that males were, in fact, aggressive in this species of birds. And so, what they did then was to attribute female aggression to what they called the PBS, which is essentially PMS, but for birds.
No.
The females were governed by their hormones, and that before or after mating spells or mating seasons, they were compelled to take up this responsibility that should have been the males. And they were able to publish this work.
Oh my gosh.
Yep, they got funding to basically come up with bum data that said that female birds are attacking each
And then publishing.
Yep, and publishing it. And their conclusion was basically bitches be crazy, but for birds.
Yeah. Birds, yeah, yep.
Broods be crazy.
Yes. And men are getting paid to do this. And there's there's like a bias towards the male perspective in this field. So, like, to any woman that is listening to this and, you listen to these male podcast hosts, just know that they don't really care about the science of it, right? Because they're cherry picking whatever is favorable to their opinion. But, going back to like the responsibility of what the male species has in all of this, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the questions we had out here for the common threads between our male species, the human males, versus our cousins in the animal kingdom. So at what stage do the males become liabilities in their troops? And does the pack ever turn on the so-called alpha, or some of the higher ranking males in their troops? And, and finally, we just wanted to also, once you get into that, if you can tell us a little bit about, we have this concept of this thing called the high value male, right? A high value male is essentially someone who is, generous, a person who's a real provider, somebody who actually cares about the family unit, and somebody who is trying to actively make the woman's life easier. And doing that to like a high degree, not just someone who's doing the bare minimum and thinks that that's enough, but someone who's really going out of their way to be more than an equitable partner, right? So, we want to know whether in the animal kingdom, there is such a thing as like a low value monkey, that doesn't add anything to the troop. And does the pack ever turn on, how do they treat the ones who are useless, essentially? I mean, because I think in their unit, at least everybody has some kind of use. But, there might be some that are absolutely bums. So, you've observed them. So we want to know, what does it mean to be a good macaque and a bad macaque,
Yeah, just to first address the question, I absolutely love this question. And in terms of human men, males, I would say they become a liability the day they're born. But
Spoken by an animal behavioralist, ladies.
But going back to the monkeys, so yes, of course, all males that are part of a group, they provide a function by simply existing, and that's the concept of group living itself. Why are so many animals group living? Why are they social? One of the biological basis for this is that it's a game of numbers. And so if there's a predator that can take you out, the more number of individuals that you hang out with, the less likely you are to be the one that's picked out of this group. And so that's one of the kind of biological bases to form these groups. But it's not enough. It's not enough to just say, hey, let's stick together so that I don't die because I can run faster than you. There has to be some more contribution to living functionally in this kind of a group. And with primates, that becomes extremely complex because of our place on the evolutionary tree, the cognitive abilities that these macaques can exhibit. And so there's a lot of complex social interactions that take place in a group. And a lot of them have to do with maintaining your position and your contributions in a group. And so when it comes to the idea of a low value male versus a high value male, so there's a lot of physiological basis to this, and there's a lot of behavioral basis to this, and there's a lot of personality traits that determine some of these kind of roles that males can take up and play. Again, a brief explanation of the primate world. There is a lot of variation in social systems. There's a lot of variation in mating systems. You see everything from monogamy to polyandry and everything in between. There's multiple male, multiple female mating systems. There's also different kinds of social systems that range from despotic, where there is sort of sequential order in which individuals behave in a certain way to each other. And so you would have individuals that do not challenge certain individuals, but will challenge certain individuals. But all the way, so from despotic all the way to tolerant, where individuals are much more tolerant of each other and will challenge each other in certain situations. So again, to come back to what a high value male and a low value male is, if we remove the aspects of genetics and physiology, some of which mostly determines whether you have a good immune system, for example, whether you're able to survive through bouts of disease, and so your offspring would be able to as well, all the way to your actual body size. And body size may not be such an important aspect, but it could. And so ultimately, what it boils down to is, as a high value male, you can contribute to the safety of the group, to being able to behave in a way that the group has the most beneficial outcome. And so even if the females are the ones tracking the resources, a male might go ahead to have a look at whether the area that they need to go to where all the fruit is growing is safe for them to enter, whether there's predators there, and so on. And so in terms of maintaining safety of the group and the territory, there may be another group that's competing for the same resources that you are. And again, the biological basis for the males having to take up this responsibility is simply because the females have the larger sex gametes, which are the eggs, as compared to the sperm in males. And so they have the added physiological requirement to then carry the offspring. And again, if you remove sex completely out of this, it's just a mutation where individuals that had the larger gamete were more advantageous to producing offspring. And over time, the kind of bifurcation between the two sexes occurred over evolutionary time. But if you go all the way back to the root, it's essentially just the few individuals that have the larger gamete versus the few individuals that then, because they don't have this larger gamete or the requirements to produce offspring and the actual carrying of the offspring, they can then focus all that sort of free time on being larger and growing larger canines and growing secondary characteristics that allow them to reduce the responsibilities that, again, the individuals with the larger gamete, the females, would have to deal with. And so essentially the bifurcation of then what the behaviors that the males need to exhibit is simply because the females don't have the luxury of being able to do it.
Yeah, just to stand on that point for a little bit, one of the other things in this study of the animal world is also males have a function because there are predators, because they have an active threat, they have a role, right? I remember you made this joke when we were talking about this earlier that like the men in our human society have basically artificially constructed a system where they control all the resources and they have all the power, but they're bad at both. They're bad at maintaining power and they're also bad at maintaining at keeping resources. So they, like even in this artificially constructed system, they're failing terribly. And you mentioned about monogamy. As a dating podcast, we're kind of in a full focus on monogamy specifically because we believe that that is probably, in the human world at least, the most equitable outcome for a woman is to have someone who's equally invested in her. Because you hear a lot of podcasts being like, polyamory and stuff, and we can go into that, but like, we don't live in a system where society is equitable to women in general. So, usually in these polyamorous situations, it's not so much that it's one woman with like 5 hot providers who are providing her everything she needs. It's usually one low life scrote who doesn't deserve even one woman, let alone like 5. So, one of the things you mentioned is that monogamy is a dual investment. Both parties, both the male and the female, have to contribute in order for it to be an effective strategy. So part of the reason why it's an effective strategy is that in an off chance of a predator, it gives enough and sufficient time for the female to escape in the off chance that they are attacked. Right? So really a man's job is to provide that kind of buffer, to be able to give the chance for his offspring to survive. So it's really to ensure that the offspring has a chance to have a better life, really. So, I think one of those things that we can take from that, at least in the human world, is that, we tell a lot of people that you should also be looking at what kind of father this person is going to make, right? Because how they treat you is a good indication of how your children might be treated. If he doesn't respect you that much, he's not going to respect your children that much. So it seems like in the animal kingdom, they have a vested interest in giving a shit about their offspring. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a strategy for survival if they don't care about their progeny at all, if I'm getting that correctly.
Yeah, I would also go ahead to say that you will not find mating systems that are monogamous unless the males and the females are contributing equally in terms of providing for the offspring. Firstly, in terms of course, if they encounter a predator, and so the females can potentially move away, but also in actively acquiring resources, not only for the offspring, but also for the female who is investing her time and energy in taking care of the offspring. And this role is, again, realizable in the sense that if the male is not contributing sufficiently, the offspring will die. In a sense, the male dies, right? Because his lineage dies, his DNA isn't passed on. In an evolutionary sense, that is the end to him. And it is, again, because it's a realizable consequence. It's either you live or you die. I want to tie together what you said about how there aren't predators in human society. In fact, the opposing force to survival, and I keep saying the word survival is because that's what really drives evolution, is mortality or death. And we've kind of done away with this idea of random mortality in human society through medicine and through the advent of all these various technologies. We don't think of mortality really as a very major driving force to our existence and our survival. And so when you say that the males really sort of are contributing by providing this protection, and we've done away with this, I tend to question then what is the role specifically of men in society. And then we also had this conversation where they can say that they're contributing to the raising of an offspring. Again, in human society, they can say that you need us because we provide you resources in the form of money. And because, again, the system is set up such that we can make more money than you can in the first place. They can say that they're going to support you and provide the money, and to whatever extent they do, but it's not a realizable consequence if they don't. You just have to sort of live with this kind of man then who is not really providing anything in a monogamous situation.
We also question what is the role of men in society.
I want them to be consequential, but science and evidence seems to be pointing to me that, that they are at sort of a standstill in terms of evolutionary advantage or benefit to the human race. Am I incorrect?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
speaking about these male podcast hosts for a second, I think that, part of the rise in the male podcast host comes from the fact that men are also questioning what their role is in society. Because so long as they artificially control resources and our access to education and jobs, they had, the upper hand. They don't have that anymore. And so they've begun to question what their use is in society, like what is their actual usefulness. And I think that, if we are to take some lessons from our cousins in the wild, I'd have to assume that, since evolution is about the survival of your lineage and by extension, the survival of you, this is part of the reason why men say they want like a legacy and why they want children, right? They haven't moved beyond the biological evolutionary impulse that is, I need to copulate with as many women as possible to make sure that I have a chance to have my bloodline continue. So they haven't gone behind the animal kingdom mindset, really. And that's why back in the old days, like, if you look at your great grandparents and your relatives beyond that, they would have so many children because they lived under harsher circumstances. And before we had all of these modern medical advancements, there's a very high likelihood that your children could die in they could be stillborn, you could miscarry, or they would die from an illness before they reached like their teenage years. Like there were so many opportunities for them to die that like part of having that many children was like to ensure that there would be a bloodline to carry on. So, and now that we have all these medical advancements, it's very uncommon in most of the world and the developed world, especially, that people have more than 2 kids. It's very rare that you hear of people being like, I have 6 siblings, I have 8 siblings. Maybe if they're like farmhands and stuff. But even then, Rose, you said you grew up in like a farming community. Was it very common in your community for people to have lots of children?
By the time I was brought up in the 80s, most farm families were not having more than 4 to 6 kids, which is still considered an appreciable number. But compared to my mom's generation, where she was one of 13, and that was just, 1 or 2 generations prior, that was a marked decrease. Actually, Diana, you're bringing up a really interesting point that I want to ask Ashni. So, Ashni, right now, I don't know, one thing Diana has pointed out is, how the United States, where I live, tends to be a region of the globe that maintains a lot of interest for people worldwide as far as what's happening politically, militarily, etc. I don't know if you've been following, but maybe you're seeing that, we're hearing all of a sudden this year, there's been a huge upsurge in all of these concerns over the birth rate dropping.
Yes, yeah.
Might there be an evolutionary advantage to that? Or what kind of light could you shed on this sort of behavioral shift among our own species?
Right. So the human race has, in a way, made the process of natural selection ineffective because we have artificially modified so much of what happens to us and how we respond to the environment. For example, removing the natural order in terms of mortality and so on. And so if we were to continue based on our own kind of wants, needs, luxuries, we would be facing extinction. I think that popularly agreed upon is just based on the past growth rates, the exponential growth rates. No species on the planet can survive beyond a certain point. Either we would have destroyed the entire planet or some sort of event would have wiped us out as a species. In that sense, a lowered birth rate is advantageous to evolution of our species because as of now, it's still not functionally impacting what would happen to us in the near future. But if trends continue, there would be a steadying of the population and we'd sort of then be closer to remaining functionally in sort of connection with the ecosystem without disrupting it too much to the point of our own extinction.
In other words, we cannot keep growing at such a rate without facing our own extinction. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, we cannot at this rate keep reproducing in this way. I think what's more interesting though is perhaps why birth rate is reducing. And then I'm going to bring in the topic of female mate selection here. And that's where, yeah.
A lot of men in these male podcasts also talk about how, women control sex and men control relationships, right? Like the access to sex versus the access to relationships. But it seems that, just to, end this point on like for a very long time, we were hearing about overpopulation. And, you and I come from a country that's very overpopulated. And it has, begun to ask this question about like this Malthusian problem, right? Which is that, are we reaching a stage where we have fewer resources than we do people. So is it, does it make sense for us to be responsible when it comes to procreating in general? And I think what's ended up happening in the developing world is that as women got more access to resources and were able to educate themselves and get better jobs, they naturally had less of a reason to marry and procreate with men, because they don't really need them that much, and they're able to have sufficient happy, fulfilled lives without men. And one of the points that you made about macaques specifically is that it is, and I think this was part of your PhD as well, is that it is entirely female driven. It's all of the human, sorry, not human, all of the connections that are formed in those troops are primarily driven by women, whether it's within, between the mothers and the children, or all of the females within the troop. And even with the males, I remember, like, I read this thing about the Japanese snow macaques where one of the male alphas was killed by a female member of the troop, and then she ended up being the alpha, or so, like, or the top of the hierarchy for a little while. And she had a younger boyfriend. I'm not, we're not suggesting to the people who are listening here to murder the president and then take over, but
But we're not suggesting it.
I'm just saying from a legal perspective,
Oh, yes, yeah, we're definitely not advising anybody.
we're not advising anybody to do this. But this doesn't have to be primate specific, but we would love to learn about why women need to be more ruthless with mate selection, and how ruthless the natural world actually is when it comes to sex and relationships.
Right. So, just to address a bunch of things that you said. So, firstly, yes, during my PhD study, there was really a lot of focus on just the female relationships. And like I said, I'll put it this way: the males come and go, but it's the females that are really your true allies and that will support you. Even in the macaques that I study to date, there are situations where I've observed that the females band together to put even the sort of high ranking male in his place, and he will respond appropriately. He knows that if he were to defy, even if it's two females or a single female that's challenging him, that he would then become the liability. And he is perceiving that when one female or more is responding to him, is sort of aggressing towards him or defying his decisions, there is a reason for it. And we will see that the male will respond appropriately. Perhaps you can translate that to males being empathetic in human society, but there is a very conscious self-awareness that even the males exhibit. And to go back, so a lot of the kind of behaviors that are exhibited by the males and females, the sexual differences are they all have a purpose, but over evolutionary time and simply to make it more efficient, because a lot of these animals don't live long enough to grow large body sizes and have large brains to cognitively process every decision. Simply for that reason, a lot of these behaviors become ritualized, which is a technical term, but it just means that repeated behavioral patterns determine your instincts, what we call instincts. There is a purpose for it, but it becomes ritualized simply to make it more efficient in terms of survival and to reduce cognitive load. But humans have evolved to have gigantic brains, and what better use can we have for them to then unritualize some of these behaviors? I think it becomes our responsibility to unritualize behavioral patterns and examine why certain sexes may behave in certain ways, or what instinct really is. It's simply repeated behavioral patterns. A lot of the times I read articles that say that feminism has to sort of defy the animal kingdom. We have to, females are more submissive because of our instincts. We tend to avoid eye contact because of our instincts. But a lot of it, and sort of like, oh, we have to tell our brains not to behave this way because we're feminists. But I think we've just been told that animals behave this way and females are more subordinate than males. But I don't actually think that's true. And again, it's because the men told us that they observed these things in the wild because they were looking for them. They were specifically looking for the females that were, if you were to quantify the submissive tendencies in macaques, for example, you would probably find that males show an absolute higher frequency of submissive tendencies simply because they are also more aggressive. So you would see that, I mean, if you quantified it, you'd see that males are more submissive than females. I could make that statement legitimately from data. And so it's just based on what we're told. And I don't think that we're really working against our instincts. I think females are driving sexual selection. And it's so funny because in some studies, they simply will not ask how does a female choose a mate. They in fact focus mostly on the physiology of the female, and this is so funny. They call it the cryptic female choice.
They tried to make that sound scientific. It didn't work.
Yeah, it's essentially that her vaginal tract is what determines whether a male is successful or not. It completely sort of ignores her actual decision making, her cognitive decision making in choosing a mate. Females in many species across the animal kingdom show extremely high levels of infidelity. They may even pretend to be monogamous, but it is advantageous to them to be able to mate with multiple males who could potentially offer them something else or something more, even if it's just genetic diversity. And so females are making many choices. To date, there is not a single paper that will sort of exclaim that females are the drivers of sexual selection. But I think it's simply the way that science is done. And then when we come to females being ruthless, I would perhaps like to end with the examples from the arachnids, the spiders, and some species of insects, where we observe sexual cannibalism, where the female will consume her male mate. And again, when men started this research, their first assumption was the female mistakes the male for prey and just eats him. And they soon found that this was not the case because females aren't so stupid as to mistake another spider for, yeah, whoops, I thought you were food. They are making the conscious choice to kill their mate. And of course, we still don't know really what drives this specific behavior. It's understudied because, so again, they were just anomalies first, like, some weird spiders doing weird things because it was the females basically killing out men. But the sort of the research as it developed, they found that some of the concepts that could explain this behavior is that when a female encounters a male that is not sort of genetically valuable, she will just do away with him.
And I mean, that supports a lot of our FDS philosophies as well, because what are we always saying in our podcast, in our forum? We're saying hypergamy benefits you, hypergamy benefits women. Don't settle for the first person that comes along, right? And when you see something you don't like, leave immediately. These are the two things that we say in our podcast all the time. And we see it in the wild as well. And we've observed in the male kingdom, in the human male kingdom, that men are a lot more submissive to other men. That's the whole purpose of them having these stupid podcasts, is because they're sitting in submission, listening to other men. So we they're just being like their monkey cousins, like they're just doing the exact same shit. They're being submissive to other men instead of figuring it out for themselves. But the other thing is that, being ruthless in the animal kingdom is also a survival strategy for a lot of these animals, right? Like, they can't afford to mate with an animal that is not going to look after them the correct way or not going to provide them something of tangible value. even if you look at like penguins and the pebbles and stuff, what was that thing about, we were talking about, for example, how abortion is like, a lot of the conservative right wing will say like abortion is unnatural, but Ashni was telling me about these species. Can you tell us about those monkeys again, like the sperm plug thing? That was very interesting.
Yeah. So it's called the copulatory plug, and it basically is when the males in certain macaque species, maybe all, they have a congealing quality, which basically prevents other males from depositing their sperm into the vaginal tract of a receptive female. And of course, I was looking for resources that actually have scientifically studied this. And of course, I didn't find any, but I know of so many instances of personal observations that particularly female primatologists have made. And we discuss is that, so it's called the copulatory plug, it's essentially the congealed semen. There have been records of females removing it from their vaginal tract and being rid of it. And that is perhaps a way that you can look at choice in wanting to conceive or not, or wanting to conceive with a certain male or not. Yeah, it's quite incredible.
Oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. You know what you're reminding me of, Ashni? To listen to you is just to like have relevation after relevation, and it's making my brain is so happy.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear that.
I'm just thinking about like so much of what you're talking about, and I come from a PhD background as well. It's in the arts, but so much of my research, I go to ask questions, or I go to look for citations that can support some of my assertions or my theories, and I can't find it because so often the men who have come before have never asked the question, or they have considered it from a completely unrelated angle that doesn't support any of the research I need to do. So what I hear you talking about when you say these are things that we haven't heard about, or that there has been no research published, this sort of cognitive bias that the male species of the researchers in your field possess means that we have lost over a century of data to extremely flawed perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't space for women scientists to ask these questions. And if there is the space, there isn't the funding to do it. And so you might be able to ask the question, but then you will hear back saying, well, this hasn't been studied before, and so it seems kind of not mainstream. But that's the whole point of science, isn't it? Is to ask or re-ask the same questions that have been asked before, but from a more valuable perspective, or from simply a different perspective that could enhance our understanding of the system. And so that we aren't left just discussing these incredible observations as if there's some sort of secret, like, oh, females do actually have a choice kind of situation that we're just whispering to each other in quiet. So yeah, so I think there's definitely, like, hopefully this changes over time, and hopefully that's where we're heading to.
And they have this choice in the wild as well. They have this choice to decide and determine what quality of partnership they're going to have. Like, as one of the biggest points you made was that almost all of the sexual interactions and like the mate selection is actually primarily driven by women and by females in most species, right? Because it's usually the female that determines whether the male gets to pass on his lineage at all. And one of the things that we say in our forum as well when we started out in Reddit was that a lot of the things that we are telling women just seem like common sense and knowledge passed on from our ancestors, but a lot of women, like in the early stages, kind of rejected that because our cosmopolitan reading, Vogue reading society is like, no, but Cosmo tells me these are 50 ways to please your man, and like, go 50-50 with him and pretend to be somebody you're not, and like work in a way that is disadvantageous to you. And so when we were coming out with this advice about like, actually care about the value of resources that someone is giving you, don't, invest your heart too quickly into someone, do play the field a little bit. Like people are really rejecting that because they were raised with this idea of like, no, everything should be 50-50, like not acknowledging the fact that like women are already doing so much work, and that women are actually doing more than 50% right now. And so, we, now that you're explaining the way that the animal kingdom is set up, it seems like a lot of the things that we're saying to women is not just common sense. There's a biological intention behind doing that actually goes back all the way to evolution, and it's the way we've evolved. We have to evaluate men ruthlessly, and nature does the same thing. It also evaluates males ruthlessly, otherwise they don't get to pass on their lineage.
Yes, and maybe here because I did not have a chance to really delve into my own dating life. I am still single, and there is a reason for it. I think a lot of because of what I study is seeing that if there is a partnership, there is an evolutionary benefit to being with a partner over being single, over being absolutely alone. And it seems like I haven't found the kind of relationship that allows me to just to have some benefits to being with another person in a relationship over simply just being single and taking care of myself. I have found that in relationships, there's in my personal relationships, and I will put a disclaimer here. I've mostly lived most of my adult life in a forest in the middle of nowhere. And so I have not had the opportunity to meet many men. But I feel that I have very high standards for what a partner should contribute in a relationship. I'd like to think that if they don't, they die. But in an evolutionary sense, I mean, in the wild
Thank
they
you
would
for
die.
clarifying. Yes, they die in the sense that you do not pass on their lineage. Yeah.
Yeah. If we were to live in the wild.
Just to protect you legally, we just want to say that she's not talking about murder.
Yeah. I'm not ripping off any men's heads, but yeah. Yeah, I cannot answer whether it's again because I've only ever had the opportunity to meet very few people. I don't want to speak for all men out there, but I haven't found the kind of equitable contribution that a partner can bring to a relationship to keep me in a relationship. And yeah, I think it's big. There's so again, like we were talking about how um, actualize, so like the you don't pass on their lineage. I think in today's world, and again there are many relationships out there where the it isn't an equal contribution to the raising of an offspring, and perhaps comparable to death would be just the decay of society in terms of having the people in younger generations that aren't able to cope mentally. Their mental health is being affected, and their ability to function in society, even in a version of society that is perhaps more reasonable than the one we currently live in. But just their ability, it shows in the offspring if the parents aren't contributing equally. And that could be a measure of how you see actualize actualizable behaviors. And I like to think of it as a comparison, as you're still being held to the standard of contributing other than just providing maybe resources and money. And I was discussing this with Diana, where we were saying some sects of society do not have the privilege to seek out a partner, and that oftentimes they have to enter a marriage or a relationship simply to succeed in life. And we still see these patterns of sort of uh, men need to step up and kind of contribute more than simply just verbal promises.
Yeah, and speaking, just to add like another little small point here is, we've been hearing a lot about this male loneliness crisis, which to me I think is very overinflated because it's never acknowledged the fact that women have been sitting out here holding the fort on their own, and for a very long time women have been the lonely ones. It's only really become an issue now that men are lonely too. But really, if you look at society as it is right now, because we're in late stage capitalism in a lot of countries, a lot of human society is profoundly lonely. And when we look at like the way that the monkeys and the primates have adapted, it seems like forming community is an essential strategy for survival. It's not just a matter of like, oh, this is nice and fun to do. There is an evolutionary incentive to do it, and like a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of these bonds are between women. And so it is actually essential to your survival to befriend and to form solidarity and strong bonds with other women.
even the males that even the males that aren't investing in raising their offspring are relying on the fact that the females are bonded amongst themselves. There is something we call alloparenting, where the females help each other raise offspring. Even and but in humans, and then in human society, when there's a monogamous relationship, there's also a simultaneous isolating of the woman from her female community, and even that we haven't gotten right. Where okay, don't invest in the offspring, but then so create this scaffolding where the woman can create her own female community, but we somehow misinterpret it where she has to be dependent on us. She has to be dependent on the men in the relationship, even when they're not providing any investment or contribution to the offspring. And so we've gotten it pretty backwards.
We've gotten it all wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. The monkeys have figured it out.
So at least we hope that the people who are listening today are, going to be mindful of the fact that actually in the wild, women support each other, they look after each other's offspring. The men have very little contribution besides looking for better places to nest, or building you a house, or bringing you a pebble, or all these other things that they're supposed to do. But again, in a lot of cases, when a female doesn't find a sufficient mate in the wild, she just doesn't mate. And I think that, this is something that people should consider as well, is that if there are no good options, you don't have to take the best of the terrible options. In the wild, they just don't take the option at all.
Yeah, I will bring up the example of Yaki, who is the Japanese macaque that you were referring to, who she defied her own mother in her macaque group. And she, I think, fought against 5 of the males in the group to establish a more dominant status. And she held the most dominant position in the group for about a year. And then mating season came around, and she was seen to exhibit behaviors that suggested she did not want to mate because it would jeopardize her position. And what she wanted was to be the one leading the group and make sort of decisions for the safety of the group rather than producing offspring. And so, even biologically, it is not our only prerogative to reproduce. We are simply stuck with the larger sex gamete, the egg, and that is by complete fluke. And so you can sort of defy that. There is no biological tendency that you must. There is no drive that you must mate and that is your sole purpose. It's just another additional bonus contribution that women already provide to society. It's just on top of everything else that we already do.
I love you putting it like that. What's that, Diana?
Do you think we should crown Yaki an unofficial FDS queen?
Yaki is now our spirit animal of SBS, and I love that Ashni is the one who named her for us. Look at this, is just so perfect. And talking with you and hearing the way you present things, this is why I've always liked science and academia and studying, because there is so much that's there for us to learn if we can get to it. I think that's always the trickiest part is being able to access and get to this information that's just waiting for us to help unlock our understanding and our common sense of the ways in which we dwell in this world. I know we have to wrap it up here shortly. Ashni, I hope this isn't the only time you come talk with us. I think this would be a fantastic ongoing series. I would love, Diana, to ask our listeners to write in with their own questions and own observations for things that we can integrate into future conversations. But I think this is just a start.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Yes, I think it's so special because, first of all, I don't think we get too many scientists out here on the podcast, and like, especially women in STEM. We don't get a lot of women in STEM out here. There's not a lot of women in STEM in general. And to be able to have you here is, first of all, so special. And, some of the talking points we have when we give advice to women, because it's not just rooted in how you function sociologically or how your cultural upbringing and all these other things. You are wired to, we recommend the book, The Gift of Fear, to a lot of people because it's about following your instincts and understanding your fear response. And this is something that has been passed down through evolution. And why shouldn't we consider the opinions of experts who are studying animal behavior, who can inform us better than these men who are coming up with these stupid, podcast things that women also end up listening to and think is legit? Like there's a lot of women out there who probably also buy into the alpha myth of the wolves because they didn't bother to investigate and because there aren't enough female animal behaviorists who are debunking and coming out and saying, and also they're not being platformed, right? Like they're not getting the platform to come out and say, hey, that's bullshit. The guy who actually made that study already came out and debunked his own study, but nobody is talking about the fact that he came out and debunked his own study, right? Everybody's talking about like still using that study like it's still a legitimate source of information. And so to have someone who's in the field, who's an active member of the field, to come and give us this advice, not just from the perspective of like what is going on in the animal kingdom, but also how it's relevant to us as human beings and how the way we respond to things and the way that we look at mate selection and the way that we look to find partnerships with men is also driven to a certain extent biological impulse. It's not coming from nowhere, it's coming from somewhere.
Not only that, Diana, but part of the reason, if not most of the reason we find ourselves in such a fix right now as a human race in a planet that's dealing with a lot of issues is because we have not followed what evolution and nature have shown us is the most effective and natural way.
And a lot of popular discourse is to kind of explain away or rationalize away and de-incentivize women from being able to follow their natural impulses. Like one of the funniest episodes we had before Rose and I joined the podcast was one called Dick Size Matters.
Classic.
And I'm sure that, in the animal kingdom, if there is something about the male that doesn't appeal to the female, for whatever reason, we try to explain away like why she's not attracted. But the point is she just isn't. And she's ruthless about enforcing those standards. And in the wild, if like our female cohort is ruthless about enforcing their standards, it just goes to show that, we are in the right about telling women to do the same here. Like you should be ruthless with your standards because it's evolutionarily advantageous to, but beyond that, it's also going to lead to a better life. Like there's a reason why you are ruthless that way.
It's also going to lead to, like our fellow female spiders, the reduction of men carrying undesirable traits in the population by not choosing to pass on their DNA. And so be ruthless. Yeah.
I need to hear that again. For me and for all the others who need to hear this, please repeat that point, Ashni.
Women, when you make a choice and you uphold extremely high standards for the men that are worth your time and worth your DNA to pass on to your offsprings, you're helping out the population by reducing the men with the undesirable traits that we all want to get rid of but don't know how.